In this time, the fate of our species is in question. Climate change and other catastrophes threaten to wipe us out. Homo sapiens, the last of the hominids. But what if things had been different? I want to explore a world where the hominids of our dreams, the elves, the dwarves, the gnomes, and all upright standing apes evolved with us. Just as the Neanderthals did before. And what would be their mark on us? In the end, would we be the ones telling their history, or them telling ours? I want to keep this as realistic as possible. So no magic, no fairies, just apes slinging stones at each other in some form or another. I've picked 4 species to start off with. Our most common fantasy compatriots: elves, gnomes, dwarves, and centaurs. To start off, we want to cover the much earlier societies. We want to assume enough technology that they are able to interact, but not so much that travel is particularly easy. Give them room to grow, so to speak. Give the cultures time and space to develop on their own. Let's start with the most divergent of the bunch, the centaurs. Pretty self-explanatory. Top human half, thick bottom half. They would thrive in open plains where their biggest advantage, mobility, comes into play. This doesn't mean that they would be limited to these places. They could still traverse other areas, just with greater difficulty. Hilly and forested areas would be difficult for them to travel, and even worse for them to fight in, where their large bodies become more of a hindrance than a help. They are a voracious people, with the average centaur taking much more resources to sustain itself. Not just in hay, but also complex proteins, as they still do have an expensive human brain to lob around. So they aren't likely to ever have particularly high populations. They are, however, likely to develop a strong tradition of horse archery, or as the centaurs call it, archery. That, and being a beast of burden, so to speak, they should be able to pull their agricultural equipment, but this strategy may not be efficient enough to break even in terms of calories. Ironically enough, the centaurs may need to domesticate horses themselves for their agricultural needs. Centaurs are probably very good bone workers and hide tanners, a people who use every part of the animal. They would, however, have very little experience or incentive to do anything with the sea, like fishing or boat building. And also, the shape of their bottom halves would make it much easier for their young to come out with larger, more developed heads and brains than their human counterparts. Half as tall as humans, but only 1/8 the weight. Gnomes would find the safety of more forested regions to their benefit. But they are not too different from humans and thus would be highly adaptable in many areas. Their smaller size makes each individual gnome need less resources overall, and makes them as a group able to support similar populations in much less desirable and thus less contested land. They would also have a major advantage toward developing agriculture. There are many reasons for this, such as the fact that, being primarily forest-dwelling, they are likely to establish forest trails for hunting and gathering much earlier on, providing an excellent opportunity to be exposed to environments where the development of slash-and-burn agriculture is possible, as well as subsistence agriculture, where they replant and thus replenish the trails they walk. Eventually, planting the seeds for applying this practice to small personal gardens, and then on a larger scale. Being smaller also means that they are likely to be mentally more primed towards working groups to deal with predators, even more so than humans. And their small stature means that they will likely find more success in trapping than hunting, making a sedentary lifestyle more immediately advantageous to them than it was for our species, making the leap to a sedentary lifestyle potentially happening a lot faster. With this would come all the benefits such as permanent structures and greater specialization. More than anything, they are going to have a higher population and thus more specialists than any other race, so their rate of technological advancement should be greater just by sheer numbers. The Achilles heel of the gnomes will likely be the rats gnawing at their heels. Having such an agricultural dependent society in or near forested areas and high populations, and thus large volumes of grain, will invite rats and other pests and open them up for infestations frequently, especially as animal husbandry will undoubtedly play a large part in their society, given the even greater difference in strength and stamina that beast of burden will have to make up for. Speaking of agriculture and animal husbandry, we have to talk about how their heavy reliance on all of this is going to affect their societal values and religious beliefs. They are very likely to pay close attention to seasonal changes and establish great spiritual importance to the harvest. the passing of the seasons, and the labor of the plow. Regarding combat, they might rely less on ranged combat when dealing with other races, thanks to their inability to use heavy bows or heavy spears. The rough, hilly, forested terrains of their homelands would help negate their height disadvantage considerably. All of this will lead to a prodigious use of guerrilla tactics. When pressed into a corner, their natural skill at trap making would help too. Dwarves are on average 4.5 feet tall, making them basically indistinguishable from the average 5'11" human male. Their short-barreled, chested, stocky bodies betraying their evolutionary start in colder, hillier regions. They sport shorter, stockier limbs, better for sprinting than for persistence hunting. Like modern humans, meaning more dense muscles and twitch fibers would likely be in play. Hairier bodies, large eyes to adapt to low-light conditions of their homeland, and eventually the underground. Sound familiar? With the exception of height, dwarves and Neanderthals could actually have similar selection pressures in many ways. So we have a population that prefers cold, mountainous environments. These don't lend themselves to developing agriculture right out of the gate. They likely would not develop it until exposed to it by another group. But these are dwarves we are talking about, meaning they will have a natural proclivity towards fungiculture. This will lend nicely to their affinity for cave dwelling. As they progress as a society, they will, due to their nature, create even more elaborate dwellings in the mountainsides. Through trial and error, they will learn techniques that allow for proper ventilation of increasingly more complex underground and mountainside dwellings. Things such as small shafts for carbon dioxide from fires to escape and for fresh air to come in. And they will have a much easier time towards discovering copperworking, metallurgy, and gem crafts. As they advance more as a society, they will show more and more agoraphobia in the general population. I've decided to keep the flavor of the race and to give them some type of bioluminescent mushrooms as well to help them out. Their lungs would also be quite versatile, having to deal with high altitudes and also underground spaces frequently. Their lifestyle and starting regions could lead to nearsightedness and light sensitivity being more common in their population than that of other races. If they do domesticate any animals, it will have to be ones that are local to the area, at least at first. So primarily ungulates, such as mountain goats. Dwarven body types are much more muscular and lacking in much fat, which would mean that the average dwarven population is quite sensitive to changes in their food supply, as they would require a high-calorie, high-protein diet, though they would be able to start supplementing their diets with river fishing and hunting. Their stocky arms being able to use bows comparable to humans, lacking the advantage of persistence hunting that humans have. Dwarven hunts would have to be shorter, more planned, and more risky. It's understandable that they may have a more collectivist culture due to this, which might actually come in handy for crops that benefit from greater group agricultural terraforming like rice or maize. To start talking about elves, you have to think about what distinguishes them the most from other species, their longevity and their psychology. In almost every piece of fiction, elves have a few consistent traits: a fascination and innate aptitude for understanding and working with nature, a deep love for beauty, beauty in art, beauty in body, an obsession with the perfection of their crafts, a tendency towards narcissism and hedonism. They feel their emotions strongly, perhaps too strongly sometimes. In a lot of ways, elven culture would be similar to that of early human culture. They may put extra effort into the symbolic. I imagine they would be the first humanoids to practice ceremonial burial, the first naturopaths, the first bead makers and animists. Physiologically speaking, elves are always depicted as lithe and slender, tall with longer limbs than humans. This would make them amazing persistence hunters and tend towards even more stamina than the average human. That being said, they also in general are much frailer, not nearly as robust and easily injured. An irony for a species with such long natural lifespans. Speaking of lifespans, the long lifespans given to the elves do not guarantee that every, or in fact most, at least early on, will make it that far. Child mortality, disease, and warfare, among many other things, would acclimatize their people to more human lifespans. That being, their fear of death would be much more palpable than that of other races. At least in theory, they have so much more to lose. Due to their longer lifespans and slower birth rates, elves will put a lot more investment into each child. The process of training the youth for the trials of adulthood would be more resource intensive, even though they might have effectively similar lifespans to humans early on, elves living in very stable environments would tend to live much longer. However, this also means that the amount of time they go through generations is much slower. They will be slower to adapt to new environments, slower to react to changes, and worst of all, they will take longer to genetically diversify. Perhaps this is where the trope of elves being more prone to disease comes from. Due to this, they are likely to avoid tropical and overly moist climates. Their constructions and buildings are likely to be very similar to that of human settlements, as would their relationship with the sea, boat building, and rivers, with the exception that their settlements would perhaps take more consideration of the local environment into play. While they may not be as flexible to social change in their societies, the craftspeople amongst them, who are more inquisitive, would benefit greatly from their lifespans. Specialists tend to only exist in societies with enough resources to support those who do not spend most of their time generating food. So the existence of specialists imply at least some sort of temporal stability. Speaking of stability, elven society seems to be depicted as more regimented and authoritarian on average. I suspect there would be a truth to this. Given their long lifespans, the accumulation of power, wealth, and influence is much less frequently disrupted by the deaths of those who have it. Think of any wealthy family, corporation, what have you, and imagine if they just persisted and never died. Now imagine their great-great-great patriarch from the medieval era is still around and kicking. A modern world still controlled by the whims of Habsburg noblemen, with all the inflexibility and backward thinking to boot. This is a problem that the elves will have to face as their technology progresses. This could be a world where sociopathy is even more evolutionarily successful of a trait than it is in our species. I think looking at elves puts a magnifying glass to the type of issues we will have to face as life extension technology matures. But enough existential dread. Let's talk about religion. I think more than anything, the elves' religions would be ones of ancestor worship, for obvious reasons, but also because the people who have so long to live have so much more time to become intimately acquainted with death, the hereafter, and living on for potentially centuries without their loved ones. When you live for so long, you start to see the ways history rhymes, and I could see a beautiful tapestry of beliefs centered around the idea of reincarnation, and the cyclical repetition of events happening throughout time. Elven culture might see time less as a straight line, and more as a circle. We will be visiting future eras in our time, and in time soon, in the upcoming videos. Was my friend at the time, and he was running a YouTube channel. Ultimately, it went under, but before it did, he was doing a live stream, and basically he tries to keep his channel really clean. The thing is, I didn't know at the time that he was recording, so I was in the bathroom, and from the viewer's perspective, here's what they heard happen. They heard a door slam open while this guy's talking about a charity event, and then a loud flushing of the toilet following it, and then that was a good ass shit. Yo, what you doing, bro? And that was that ended his stream a bit early, unfortunately.
Hey, it could be worse. He could be vouched and have his wife walk in naked while he was streaming.
Oh God. Well, I mean, it might have actually been worse because I also kind of said the N-word, and I don't think any of them knew I was black. So, well.
Yeah, you don't like. I remember. We used to go on Skype,
yeah,
and we would ask people, who do you think was black, and they would always pick me. They'd always time.
Pick you. I never got that. Like I'm literally the blackest person in the Skype chat, and everyone thought I was from Quebec or some shit.
I think it's my slight southern accent.
Yeehaw! Howdy, partner.
Okay, scroll up a little. Scroll down a little.
Right.
And then
fuck. Blooper time. No, I know your mouse is being fucking weird. What the fuck?
You need to put on something like
it was on. That's not a gamepad. That's just a copy of. What is this?
Fortnite.
Oh my god, you fucking cringe.
That's what I have it for. That's all I use Fortnite for. I only use it.
Liar, you bought it, so you probably played. You fucking zoomer.
I played one game and I hated it.
Well, that was too much already. Into the pit.